Joining me now is Lynette Ong. She's a professor of political science at the University of Toronto. In Beijing, we have Victor Gao. He's the director of the China National Association of International Studies. And in Washington, D.C. is Sophie Richardson. She's the China Director for Human Rights Watch. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Lynette, let me start with you. This Canada-China spat, it looks and feels like a hostage ransom situation in many ways. Is it?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Yes, it does look like a hostage diplomacy. What China has been doing is detaining Canadians, two Canadians in the hands of the Chinese authorities, what looks like tit-for-tat strategy for Canada's arrest of Meng Wanzhou, who is the CFO of Huawei, the flagship technology companies from China. The backdrop is really the technology war going on between US and China, and Canada is just assisting the United States detaining Meng Wanzhou on the request of the US authorities.
Victor Gao, is this what China is doing with Robert Schellenberg, for example, his death penalty, nothing to do with drug smuggling and all about sending a message to the Canadians?
First of all, China-Canadians have very good relations for decades. And this recent round of deterioration of relations between China and Canada is not triggered by China. It's simply triggered by Canada itself. And I hope Canada will have a chance to reflect and come up with a solution as quickly as possible. Now, I think the Chinese government has already made the point very clear. There is no connection between Meng Wanzhou's case and the arrest of several Canadians in China, as well as the death sentence passed out to Mr. Schellenberg. I think this is absolutely correct because these cases are very, very different. However, philosophically speaking, everything in the world is interconnected with each other. If anyone believes that there is no connection at all, philosophically speaking, I think he or she is indulging in his or her fantasy. There must be some connection, even though there is no legal connection. And I think the Canadian government really need to wake up to the reality that they need to deal with the Meng Wanzhou case very properly, rather than really hashing out.
Let me put on my philosophical hat and take you up on that. So philosophically speaking, if it's interconnected and it is a response, then is it justified?
Whether it is justified or not, that's a completely another level of questions. I think the recent deterioration of relations between China and Canada is triggered by Canada, and it needs to be solved by Canada. Otherwise, the relations will be more and more poisoned, and both China and Canada will be victims of the deterioration of the relations between China and Canada. We cannot afford that. We need to restore the relations back to normalcy.
Okay. So Sophie Richardson, we have on the one hand a technology company and the Canadians having concerns about how they do business and whether they might be overreaching and so on. We don't know exactly, the concerns from the Americans and the Canadians. And on the other hand, you have human rights issues. Philosophically, they're connected, according to Victor Gao. Who's in the wrong here? Is it China, Sophie?
Well, I think, we're not dealing in the realm of philosophy. We're dealing in the realm of fact and of law. And I think the fact that Mr. Schellenberg was retried, something like fewer than 2% of all criminal cases in China are ever retried, when it was without providing credible evidence and in the face of significant, although common, violations of fair trial rights in China, that he was held for as long as he was without being charged, that he was denied access to family and lawyers. I think when you line all of that up, there's nothing philosophical about it. It's a very politically motivated prosecution.
Right. And so we have the Huawei chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, arrested, as we mentioned. That was in Vancouver Airport. Now, Lynette Ong, China has threatened repercussions on Canada if Huawei 5G is banned. Tell me what that means to the Canadians. How is that being received by the Canadians, that threat?
It hasn't been received well because I think whether or not a country has decided to go with any technology should be an independent decision made by the country, considering all sorts of facts. I think the fact of the matter is that Canada is really caught in between a rock and a hard place. So let's reverse 7 weeks ago. Trudeau administration, in contrast with the predecessors, has actually been very gung-ho about building strong relationship with China, right? And then, and we are one of the very few countries who actually hasn't denounced Huawei's 5G technology. So all along, we have been friends of China, and the request of Meng Wanzhou was very much at the request of the arrest of Meng Wanzhou was at the request of U.S. authorities.
Right.
It wasn't at our own initiative. So we are so our hands are actually very, very tight. There's nothing much that we can do to get out of this situation.
Victor Gao, when Ambassador Liu She said there will be repercussions, it's Canada's business, right? They can decide what technology they want to use. If they don't want to use the Huawei 5G, why should China try to punish them for it? What are they going to do? Arrest more Canadian citizens and throw them in jail?
No, first of all, I think it's completely a decision for Canada to make as to what kind of 5G technologies it wants to use, either Huawei or by another company. That should be a commercial decision. If it is a political decision, that's a pity, and I hope the Canadians will be sane enough and wise enough to separate the commercial decision from a political decision. The United States is very much making a political decision on Huawei, and I hope it will not influence the Canadian decision. If, for example, by the end of the day, if the Canadian side decides not to Huawei, I would say the loss is on the Canadians, because whatever they do for the 5G technology, the backbone and the related applications will come along at a higher price, probably lower quality, lower efficiency, and the consumers in Canada will suffer as a consequence. So be my guest if they decide not to use Huawei or use Huawei. And I don't think anyone in China should be agitated about that. We just hope the Canadians will be wise and commercial rather than political. Don't become an accomplice of a very eerie behaving United States government.
Sophie Richardson, going back to the trial of Schellenberg, it's interesting that reporters were invited to observe the trial. What do you think was behind that? What's the message being sent by the Chinese?
I think it's an attempt to create the illusion of transparency where it really hasn't existed from the beginning. And so I think it does very little to stave off concerns about whether he's actually had a fair trial.
Victor Gao, the illusion of transparency?
No, I don't think so. First of all, I hope no one in the world, in any country, including Canada or in the United States, should be a defender for Mr. Schellenberg. He is convicted of trying to smuggle more than 200 kilograms of drugs from China to, among all countries, Australia. This is really a heinous crime. And I think China is a sovereign country. China has its own legal system. And the court worked and passed on a death sentence to Mr. Schellenberg. I think all the countries in the world, including Canada, should respect the rule of law in China. Of course, Mr. Schellenberg can appeal again to the Supreme Court in China.
I mean, even though drug smuggling is bad, right?
What the Supreme Court in China will do.
It was convenient.
And this most likely will have some impact with what the Canadians are doing against Madam Meng Wanzhou.
Okay, yeah, but it was convenient, right? He got 15 years and then suddenly, by the click of a finger, he's retried and he gets the death penalty at a time when the Canadians decided to adhere to the extradition request of the United States. Awfully convenient. Still think it's completely independent?
No, the reality is that there was a decision passed on to Mr. Schellenberg. He appealed, and then in the appellate course, the Chinese court found new evidences which turned Mr. Schellenberg from an accomplice to a ringleader in this drug smuggling case. And his liability was increased because of the new evidence found in the process. And I think this is truly, according to a legal process, it's not an appellate decision. It's a retrial of Mr. Schellenberg.
Sophie Richardson.
I think nobody should doubt the validity of the evidence against Mr. Schellenberg.
So, Sophie, do you accept that argument?
You know, I find it extraordinary how willing people are to defend China's judicial system without imagining what it would be like if they or a family member were themselves enduring, you know, the lack of access to a lawyer, more than a year held without being charged. You know, do people then really actually feel it's a fair trial? I think that's sort of a peculiar disconnect. And let's be very clear. You know, the Chinese judicial system explicitly states itself that it exists to serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And so in that sense, it's been very easy for an organization like mine over the years to document the ways in which political interests have dictated legal outcomes. And I think what's happened to Mr. Schellenberg falls squarely in that frame of analysis.
Back to the big picture, realpolitik, Lynette Ong, is the difficult aspect of this for Canada the fact that it needs China more than China needs it on multiple levels? And is that why Trudeau needs to tread carefully, perhaps?
Definitely. I think traditionally we have been very close allies of the United States, and Canada and China is also Canada's second trading partner. So we really couldn't afford to offend any party. And you know, if China has a problem with U.S., I think it should really rightly take up the issue with the United States. I think putting pressure on Canada really wouldn't help with resolving the issue. Really wouldn't help with the release of Meng Wanzhou, because once Meng Wanzhou is in the custody of the Canadian court, the Canadian government cannot actually intervene in the court decision because of separation of powers in this country.
Victor Gao, pick on someone your own size. Meng Wanzhou is wanted by the United States. Canada's merely responding to an extradition appeal. If you want to fight with someone, fight with America.
First of all, who arrested Meng Wanzhou? Who holds Meng Wanzhou right now?
That's how it works.
Which jurisdiction
that's
is
how the
Meng
extradition. That's how
Wanzhou right now.
But that's how the extradition treaty works.
Wake up to the reality. Don't fool around. Don't beat it up about the bush. Wake up to the reality that Canada held Meng Wanzhou. That's the reality, and you need to bark at the right tree. Bark at your own tree. Don't bark at the death sentence for Mr. Schellenberg. He is sentenced to death. And there is an appeals process leading all the way to the Supreme Court of China. And we can work with that process. Of course, I'm a registered attorney, and I need to advise my clients to do the right thing according to the right legal process. But between China and Canada, the real thing that's really at stake is Madam Meng Wanzhou. Don't fool around. Let's face the reality. Prime Minister Trudeau, you need to face up to the reality.
Can I just intercept here? You know, I think if the purpose of the Chinese authority is to push Huawei up to be a global international player, which, you know, 7 weeks ago, many people in this country actually believe that Huawei is the lead player in providing 5G network. But 7 weeks later, you know, given the, well, can we say, you know, increasing belligerent behavior of the Chinese authorities, it is really not helping Huawei or any of the multinational companies of China out there. It's the global ambassadors. And I think global companies of China are actually suffering because of the behavior of the Chinese authorities. They are actually paying a price for how the government actually behaves.
Okay, well, testing times for Canada and China. Listen, Victor Gao, Sophie Richardson, and Lynette Ong, the story is not going to go away anytime soon. And we look forward to having you back on the Newsmakers. But for now, I'm out of time. So thank you very much for joining us.